I've been telling this story for going on 20 years now, and I expect I'll be telling it still when they put me in the ground out behind the south pasture. Reuben's boy asked me last autumn how his father came back to life after his mother died, and I told him to pull up a chair and give me a good hour, because it wasn't one moment or one day. It was 3 children standing at a road gate and a woman on foot who had sense enough to stop. My name is Cy Odell. I was foreman of the Gatch Ranch for 31 years, from the spring Reuben's father Holt hired me on until the spring I got too stiff in the knees to pull fence wire without swearing loud enough to startle the horses. I knew Reuben Gatch from the time he was a boy of 9 trailing after his daddy with rope burns on his palms and a look on his face like he was trying to memorize the way every gate latch worked. I watched him marry Martha Howell from over in Cauldron Flats, watched him build the second bedroom and the big kitchen, because he wanted her to have more than a tired old ranch house. I watched him lose her 18 months after their youngest was born, on a February night so cold the basin froze solid, and I watched what that loss did to a man who had no practice at falling apart and no intention of learning. What it did was this: it made him stone, not the brittle kind that cracks under a boot heel, the deep quarry kind, gray and dense and immovable. He kept the ranch running, kept the cattle sorted and the fences mended and the books balanced. He kept his children fed and clothed and enrolled at the schoolhouse in Harrow. He did everything a father was supposed to do, with a punctuality and a thoroughness you could set a clock by. He just did it without warmth, the way you do when you've decided warmth costs more than you can afford to spend. The children felt it. Josie was 11 that year, a serious girl with her mother's dark eyes and her father's habit of sizing up a situation before she moved. Tad was 8, all elbows and noise and a laugh that rattled the window glass, though the laugh had gone quiet in the months after Martha. Pearl was 5. She was the one I worried about, because she was too young to understand why the house had changed and too old to forget that it had. She'd taken to sitting at the kitchen window in the mornings with her cheek against the cold glass, watching the road that ran along the south end of the property, as though she expected someone to come walking down it. By the time summer came on, all 3 of them had taken up the habit together. Every Sunday morning, after church and before the midday meal, Josie and Tad and Pearl walked out to the front gate on Sutter Road and stood there in a line, looking east. I don't know who started it or when exactly it became a fixed thing, but it was fixed by July. I asked Josie once what they were watching for. She said, "I don't know, Cy. Someone, I expect." I didn't say anything to Reuben about it. It didn't seem like something you could say to a man like him, that his children were standing at the road gate on Sundays waiting for a someone they couldn't name. The Sunday it mattered was the 3rd week of August. I remember because I was sitting on the top rail of the corral, patching a split in a length of rain leather, and I could see the gate from where I sat. The 3 of them were out there the way they always were, Josie upright and watchful, Tad scuffing the dirt with the toe of his boot, Pearl holding the gate post with both hands and leaning out over the road in the way that drove her sister to distraction. The woman came from the east, walking slow and steady, carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder and a smaller bundle tied at the wrist. She wore a plain gray dress that had been washed so many times it had given up any particular color and settled somewhere between dust and cloud. She had a wide straw hat pushed back on her head, and she walked the way people walk when they've been at it for several hours and have calculated exactly how much energy they can afford per mile. She might have passed the gate without stopping. She was clearly heading somewhere. There was a purposefulness about the direction of her feet even when the rest of her was tired, but she slowed when Pearl started to cry. Not a loud cry, not the kind of cry that announces itself. Pearl had a way of crying that was almost private, like she was hoping nobody would notice but couldn't help it either. She'd been holding the gate post and looking east, and something about the sight of that woman, a woman walking alone, moving at the pace of someone who knew how to carry her own weight, had started Pearl going in that quiet way she had. The woman stopped. She set her bag down in the road and crouched, which brought her to Pearl's height, and she said something I couldn't hear from the corral. Whatever it was, Pearl stopped crying almost immediately and stared at her with the wide, assessing look children give strangers they've decided to trust before the adults can tell them not to. I got down from the rail and walked over. By the time I reached the gate, Josie had opened it, which was a thing I'd never seen her do for a stranger, and the woman was standing inside the property line with her bag at her feet, and Tad circling her at a radius of about 6 feet with his hands in his pockets, which was how he examined things he was interested in. "This the Gatch Ranch?" the woman asked when she saw me coming. "It is," I said. She had a plain, steady face, not a young woman, but not old either, somewhere in the middle where a person has settled into what they actually look like and stopped fighting it. Brown eyes that had some thinking in them. A small cut on her right hand, partly scabbed, like she'd caught a piece of wire recently. "I'm not looking for charity," she said, before I could offer any. "I'm a seamstress. I do fine work, mending, alterations, any cloth repair you have. I've been walking since Millfield day before yesterday and I'm tired, and I'd take a meal and one night in a barn in exchange for a full day's work. After that, I'll be on my way to Dunner, where I have a cousin." I looked at the children. Pearl had attached herself to the woman's left side in the tentative way she attached herself to things she wanted, standing close enough to be within reach without quite touching. "What's your name?" I asked. "Delaharne," she said. I told her mine. Then I said, "We've got mending enough to keep 2 people busy a week," which was true. After Martha died, the household mending had fallen to me when it fell at all, and I was not a man built for fine needlework. Delaharne looked at me for a moment and then looked at Pearl, who was now examining the frayed end of the woman's sleeve the way Pearl examined everything, with her whole face. "One day," Della said. I said, "One day." "One day, then," I agreed. "Come on up to the house and we'll see about getting you fed." I took her up myself. Reuben was in the north barn with the breeding records when I knocked on the frame and told him we had a woman come to trade work for a meal and a night. He looked up from the ledger with the expression he wore for most things those days, which was the expression of a man who has assigned a moderate amount of attention to the situation and is already thinking about the next one. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Seamstress," I said. "Fine mending." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Kitchen's hers to use. Give her the back room in the bunkhouse." And he went back to his ledger. That was how Delaharne came to the Gatch Ranch. She stayed 5 days. I want to be fair about how that happened, because it wasn't a plan on anyone's part. The first day she sat at the kitchen table from sunup to well past noon and worked through the mending pile without comment or complaint. And the work she did was fine enough that I fetched more from the bunkhouse chest, and she kept at it without being asked. By the time the midday meal came around, she had the kitchen in better order than it had been since Martha, and she put a pot of something on the stove that smelled like a home was supposed to smell. And when Reuben came in from the north pasture and sat down at the table, he ate 2 full bowls without saying much of anything. After the meal, Josie asked her if she knew how to do the smocking stitch on a dress front, because Martha had been teaching her and she'd forgotten the middle part. Della showed her twice, slowly, and then watched while Josie practiced it on a scrap of cotton, correcting the tension with one finger pressed to the cloth and nothing said. That was the first day. The second day I came in from the morning feed and found Pearl sitting on the kitchen floor next to Della's chair, playing a clapping game with her hands, and explaining the rules to herself in a running narration, the way Pearl did when she was comfortable somewhere. Della was mending Tad's good jacket, the one he'd caught on a nail and put a 2-inch tear in the lining of, and not interrupting Pearl's narration except to nod occasionally, which Pearl took as active participation. I asked Della that evening if she wanted me to hitch a ride east for her the following morning, since one of our hands was going into Harrow. She said she thought she'd stay another day if it was all the same, because she wanted to finish Tad's jacket properly, and she'd started on a piece of piecework for Josie that she didn't like to leave half done. On the third day, Tad asked her at breakfast if she'd ever seen a ranch before. Della said she'd grown up near a cattle operation in the hill country east of Pelham. Tad said, "Do you want to see the horses?" I watched Reuben's face from across the table when Tad said that. He was looking at his coffee cup. He'd had a horse die the previous spring, a gray mare his wife had been fond of, and he hadn't let the children anywhere near the horse pasture since, which was a cruelty of the accidental kind, the kind that comes from not being able to separate your grief from the things it touched. But he didn't say no. He went on looking at his coffee cup, and Della said yes to Tad. She'd like to see the horses very much, and they went off together after breakfast, Tad's voice carrying back across the yard while he explained, at length, everything he knew about every horse currently on the property and several he'd read about in a book. I found Reuben at the fence line that afternoon, replacing a post that had rotted at the base. I worked the other end without saying anything. After a while he said, "How long is she planning to stay?" "She hasn't said," I told him. He drove the post another half-inch with the maul. "She all right in the bunkhouse?" "Seems comfortable enough." He nodded once and drove the post again. That night I heard Pearl's voice from the kitchen window, clear and carrying in the warm evening air, and Della's lower voice answering her, and then the sound of them both laughing at something, a real laugh, sudden and short, the way laughter goes when it surprises you. I hadn't heard Pearl laugh like that since February. On the fourth morning, Della announced at breakfast that she would be on the road to Dunner the following day, and that she wanted to spend the day doing any heavier repairs that needed doing before she went. This produced a response from Pearl that I am going to describe only as a crisis, conducted entirely in Pearl's near-silent way, which meant she sat down on the kitchen floor and did not move from it for the better part of 20 minutes. Josie, who was old enough to recognize what was happening and young enough to feel it keenly, went very still at the table and looked at the table and said nothing. Tad went outside. Reuben was not in the kitchen for any of this. He was already in the north pasture, but when he came in at midday I had the impression he'd been told about Pearl's mourning by someone, because he sat down at the table and said to Della without preamble, "I need someone to manage the house. Cooking and mending and general keeping. Wages, $3 a month, and the back room's yours." He said it the way he said most things, with the delivery of a man reading from a list, and then he looked at his plate. Della was quiet long enough that I thought she was going to say no. Then she said, "I have a cousin in Dunner expecting me." "I know it," Reuben said. She was quiet again. "I'd need to get word to her." "I'll send a hand with a letter." Another quiet. Pearl was sitting beside Della by this point. She'd taken up a position about 4 inches from Della's elbow at every meal, close enough to be touching if either of them shifted, and she was holding very still in the particular way she held still when she was hoping an outcome would go a certain direction. 2 months trial, Della said. After that we each decide. Reuben looked up from his plate. "Fair," he said. That was the bargain, clean and plain, with no more said about it than needed saying. The 2 months passed, and nobody said anything about the trial ending, so it didn't. I want to be clear about how things stood between Della and Reuben in those first months, because it would be easy from the outside to imagine it was simpler than it was. It was not simple. Reuben Gatch was not a man who let things in easily at the best of times. He was the kind of man who looked at the world through the bars of his own careful assessment, and what had happened with Martha had put an extra bar across the gate. He was not cold to Della. He was not rude. He was correct and consistent, the way a man is when he has decided to treat a situation as a business arrangement and is determined to honor the terms. He thanked her for meals. He told her clearly when something needed doing. He paid her on the first of the month without needing to be reminded. but he kept himself at a certain distance, the way you keep yourself back from a fire when you've been burnt before and you remember exactly how it felt. Della, for her part, did not push. That was the thing about her that I came to understand as the autumn moved in. She had a very particular kind of patience, the kind that doesn't feel like waiting because it's not waiting for anything. She wasn't there to change Reuben or soften him or find the way through his walls. She was there because she'd taken a job, and because 3 children needed someone in the house who could see them clearly, and because the back room was dry and the wages were fair. The children were another matter entirely. Josie warmed to her in the careful, measured way Josie did everything over a period of weeks through the medium of needlework and practicality. She started by asking Della about stitches, moved to asking about other things Della had seen or known in her years before the Gatch Ranch, and eventually arrived at simply talking, in the evening after dinner while they did the mending, the way Josie had talked with her mother. I saw Reuben notice this once. He was passing the kitchen door, and he slowed for just a moment at the sound of Josie's voice, going at the particular cadence she had when she was telling something she'd been saving up to tell, and then he walked on. Tad gave her his trust in one piece, on the day she fixed his boot. It was the left one. The sole had come half away from the upper at the toe, and Tad had been pinching it shut with his fingers every time he put it on, and hoping nobody noticed. I'd noticed, and Reuben had noticed, but neither of us had done anything about it because that kind of small domestic repair had fallen into the gap between the things a foreman did and the things a grieving man thought about. Della noticed it on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon she'd whittled a proper last from a piece of scrap wood, cobbled the sole back with a double row of stitching and a cut of heavy leather from the repair box, and pressed it under a board weight overnight. Wednesday morning, she put it on the floor outside Tad's door without saying anything about it. Tad wore those boots for 3 years before he grew out of them. He told me once that they were the best-fitting pair he'd ever owned. Pearl was the easiest and the most complete. Pearl had decided at the gate on Sutter Road in the first 30 seconds of their acquaintance, and she never revised the decision. She did not transfer Martha's place to Della. She was too young to articulate the distinction, but she seemed to hold it anyway, the way children sometimes understand things they can't explain. What she did was accept Della as her own particular person, a thing entirely outside the arrangement she'd had with her mother, and she pursued the relationship with the focused devotion she brought to everything she cared about. By October, Pearl was sleeping better. By November, the kitchen window habit had stopped. Reuben noticed. I could see him noticing. It would cross his face sometimes, a small thing, a flicker, when he came in from the pasture and heard Pearl's voice in the kitchen, steady and easy, telling Della something about her day. A man can be grateful without knowing what to do with the gratitude. He'd nod at Della at breakfast, ask if she needed anything from the supply run, make sure the woodbox outside the kitchen was kept full without being asked. It was the language of a man doing his best with the tools he had. The first crack came in November, and it came sideways, the way the important things often do. There was a mare in the horse pasture, a chestnut, 4 years old, one Reuben had bought in the spring from a rancher over in Cullen Flats. She was sound and willing, but she'd been skittish since they brought her, and Reuben had been working her slowly, which was his habit with horses that had been handled rough before you got them. I came up to the pasture one afternoon and found Della at the fence, watching Reuben work the horse in the near pen, and I went and stood beside her. We watched for a while. Reuben had a good hand with horses, patient, low, always reading what the animal was telling him, and the chestnut was starting to trust the approach. "He's good at that," Della said quietly. "He is," I agreed. "Best I've seen for a nervous horse." She was quiet for a moment. "He's the same with the children when he doesn't know he's doing it. I see it sometimes in the morning. He doesn't say a word, just adjusts things around them. Makes sure Tad's place at the table has a little more room. puts Pearl's cup where she can reach it without leaning. I didn't say anything to that. He's careful, she said. It's just all aimed at the wrong thing right now. I looked at her. She was still watching Reuben in the pen, her arms resting on the top rail, her face easy and neutral. Wrong thing, I said. At keeping things still, she said. So nothing else changes, I understand it. She pushed off the rail. I've done the same thing. She went back to the house. I stayed at the fence. Reuben brought the horse in at dusk and came past me toward the barn. He slowed when he saw my face. What? He said. Nothing, I said. Good work with the chestnut. He looked at me for a long moment with the particular look he had when he knew someone was not saying the whole of a thing, and then he went on into the barn. December came in hard. The basin got 2 feet of snow in the second week, and the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that makes the air creak when you breathe. We were busy with the cattle, keeping the water troughs from icing solid, getting the feed out, checking the herd for any that had gone down in the cold. Reuben and I were putting in 14-hour days, and the hands were stretched, and the ranch ran on the momentum of a place that knows what winter work looks like and does it without being told. Della kept the house. There was no smaller way to put it. She kept a fire going all day in the kitchen stove, and a secondary one in the front room when it got cold enough to need it. She made sure the children were in dry clothes and warm ones. She laid in the evening meals early so Reuben and I could eat as soon as we came in from the last round. She boiled water for warming pans in the beds at night, and she managed the supply of wood and kerosene with a precision that kept us from running short. She did all of this without complaint or commentary. It was simply what needed doing, and she did it. The day the calf went missing was a Wednesday. One of the younger cows had dropped a January calf 2 weeks early, not unheard of, but a risk in that cold, and we'd put the pair in the near barn with extra bedding and thought they were set. Somehow the calf got out. We don't know how. The barn door was latched when we checked, but there was a gap at the base of the south wall where the snow had worked its way under, and a calf that age, confused and cold, might have gone at it. We found the gap at noon when we did the feeding. No calf. Reuben's face went flat in the way it did when something had gone wrong that shouldn't have. I got 2 of the hands and we went out in sectors, which in that snow and that cold was serious work. The temperature was 6 below and the wind was picking up from the north. Tad came out into the yard while we were organizing, bundled to the eyes, and said he wanted to help look. Reuben said no. He said it without harshness, but he said it firm. The cold was too hard, and there was enough to manage without a boy underfoot in a search. Tad's face went the way it went when he was genuinely hurt by something, but was trying to be a man about it, and he went back inside. I found the calf 2 hours later, in the draw behind the east fence, curled against a snowbank and half gone from cold. I got it back to the barn and into warm bedding and its mother, and by evening it had taken a feed and we thought it would make it. When I came in that night, Tad was at the kitchen table doing figures for school with the look of a boy who'd been sitting there being responsible for longer than he wanted to. Della was at the stove. Reuben came in behind me, late and cold-stiff and tired, and he sat down at the table and started pulling off his boots without looking up. After a moment, Tad said, without lifting his eyes from his figures, "Cy found the calf." "I heard," Reuben said. "I could have helped look," Tad said, quiet, not accusing, just saying it. There was a silence. I was by the door with my coat still on, and I didn't move. Reuben said, "Yes, you could have." That was all. But Tad looked up, and there was something in Reuben's face that hadn't been there before, not quite an apology, but the recognition behind an apology, which is the harder thing. "Next time," Reuben said. Tad went back to his figures, but his shoulders dropped about half an inch. Della put a plate in front of Reuben without being asked. He looked at it and then looked up at her, and she was already turned back to the stove, and he said, "Thank you." She said, "Eat it while it's hot, Reuben." It was the first time I'd heard her use his name. I don't think she noticed she'd done it. I don't think he did either just then. But I did. It was Pearl's sickness that finished what the rest of the winter had started. It came on fast, the way sickness does in children, and it came in the deepest week of December. A fever that climbed to worrying in the first night and stayed there for 3 days. Della sent for the doctor in Harrow, which meant sending a hand 20 miles in cold that had not relented, and in the meantime she managed Pearl herself, with cool cloths and careful dosing, and the particular calm she had in situations that required it. Reuben did not sleep those 3 days. He did not say this. He continued to go out to the cattle in the mornings the way he always did. He continued to manage the hands and the feed and the fence checks that couldn't wait on weather. But every time I came into the house, for meals, for reports, for anything, he was either in the hallway outside Pearl's door or in her room itself, sitting in the chair that Della had brought in and set beside the bed. He sat there the way men sit when they are making themselves small, with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them and his eyes on the small face in the bed. Della was in and out checking the fever, adjusting the covers, bringing water and broth, and she moved past Reuben without comment, working around him the way water works around a stone, not requiring him to be anything other than what he was. I watched him watch her once, from the doorway where he hadn't seen me, watch the careful, economical way she tended Pearl, the steadiness of her hands, the low murmur she used that was not quite speech and not quite singing, and I saw something move across his face that he hadn't let move there in a long while. Pearl's fever broke on the 3rd night. I was in the front room when I heard Reuben's voice from the hallway. Just a sound, not words, the kind of sound a man makes when something he was holding and releases all at once. And then Della's voice, low and steady, and the sound of Pearl talking in the tired, slightly confused way sick children talk when they are coming back to themselves. I went to bed. The next morning Reuben was in the kitchen when I came in, which was early enough that Della was still at the stove with her hair not yet properly up and her working shawl over her dress. He was standing at the window with a cup of coffee, not looking at anything particular through the glass, and when he heard me he said, without turning, "Pearl ate some of the oatmeal." "Good," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's going to be all right." I poured myself a cup and stood at the other end of the window. The yard was early blue, the snow still, the horses in the far pasture just beginning to move toward the water trough. "Della kept her steady," he said. "She did," I agreed. He was quiet for a long time. "Sigh," he said. "Yep. I think I've been an idiot," he said. I thought about that. I said, "You've been a man dealing with a hard thing in the only way you knew." "Same thing, maybe." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe not. What are you planning to do about it?" He looked at his cup. "Haven't figured that out yet." Della turned from the stove with a pan in her hand and looked at both of us with the dry patience she had for mornings when men were standing in her kitchen being mysterious. "If either of you are going to be useful, the wood box is low," she said. I went and got wood. What happened between Reuben and Della after that happened slowly, which is the right speed for something that is going to last. He started talking to her, not about important things at first, about the cattle, about the repair the north barn needed, about the supply run. Small talk, the kind that costs a man like Reuben a good deal more than it looks like it does, because the practice of saying ordinary things out loud had gotten rusty in him and he had to work at it. She answered him the way she answered everything, directly and without ceremony, and she did not make anything more of it than it was, which was exactly right. Josie saw it before anyone else. She was 11, which is old enough to understand most things adults are doing and young enough to feel uncomplicated gladness about it, and I caught her watching them at the supper table one evening, with an expression on her face that looked almost exactly like the one she'd had at the funeral, when the minister had said that her mother had been dearly loved by everyone who knew her, a look of tremendous feeling very carefully contained. Tad didn't notice until Reuben started letting him come along on the horsework, which was the direct result of Reuben paying more attention to the parts of his children that were actually in front of him. Once that started, Tad was so focused on the horses that 3 armies could have marched through the ranch, and he'd have missed them. Pearl noticed nothing because to Pearl the situation had been settled the day she stood at the gate on Sutter Road and decided, and everything since then had been the world catching up to what she'd already known. The conversation, the real one, the one that mattered, happened in February, which I can date precisely because I know the date because of what came after, and what came after is the point. I was not there. I know it happened because Reuben told me the following morning, out in the barn, in the low, plain voice he used for things he was telling you because he needed to say them out loud rather than because he expected a response. He'd asked her to stay, not as a housekeeper, permanent, he said. He'd said it plainly, the way he said everything, that he understood she had her own life to arrange and her own direction she'd been heading, and that the arrangement they had was a fair one, and he had no claim on her beyond what the work entitled him to. But he said, and this, as best I could get it from Reuben, was what he said, that the house had been alive again since she came, and not just for the children, and that he would like her to consider whether she wanted to stay in it as something more than the woman who tended it. If she found she could feel that way about a stubborn and previously shut-down man with 3 children who would one day be grown and gone and leave the 2 of them to manage. I asked him what she'd said. He looked at the barn floor. He said, she said that stubbornness in a man wasn't generally a problem if the stubbornness was pointed in the right direction, and that she'd been thinking about whether Dunner was really where she'd been heading since about October, and that yes. I said yes. He said yes. I went and looked at a horse for a while, the way a man does when he wants to give another man a moment. They married in the spring in the parlor, with the minister from Harrow and Josie standing next to Della in a dress she'd sewn herself from a pattern Della had taught her, and Tad and Pearl on the other side, and me and the hands against the wall with our hats in our hands. It was not a large occasion. It didn't need to be. Pearl held Della's hand through most of the ceremony. When the minister said the part about 2 becoming one household, Pearl looked up at Della with the settled expression of someone whose original position has been confirmed by events, and Della looked down at her and squeezed her hand once. I want to tell you one more thing, because I think it's the part of the story that says what the story is actually about. A year after the wedding, in the spring of the year following, I was out at the south fence replacing a length of wire when Reuben came riding out from the ranch at a pace that meant he wanted to tell me something. He pulled up the horse and sat there for a moment with his hands on the pommel, and a look on his face that I can only describe as a man who has been caught off guard by his own life. "Della's expecting," he said. I finished the wire, I straightened up and looked at him. He didn't say anything else. He was looking back at the ranch, at the long, low shape of the house with the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, and there was something on his face I hadn't seen there in 3 years, since before Martha, maybe, since before the weight of the grief had settled in and made itself at home. It was not the look of a young man, nothing as uncomplicated as that. It was the look of a man who has been to the bottom of something and climbed back out and found that the air up top still works, and the light is still there, and the world has decided to give him another long chance at it. He turned the horse and rode back toward the house. I watched him go. I drove the last staple into the wire and gathered my tools, and I stood there at the south fence with the afternoon sun coming flat across the basin and the smell of new grass coming up through the thaw, and I thought about 3 children standing at a road gate on a Sunday in August, looking east. I've known a lot of things to arrive in this life that were not what you expected when they came. They're usually traveling on foot, carrying their own weight, with a cut on one hand and a plain gray dress and enough dignity to wait until you figure out what you've been given. Delaharne came walking down Sutter Road with a canvas bag on her shoulder and a somewhere to be and no reason at all to stop, except that a child was crying, and she stopped anyway. That's the thing when I tell it. That's the part I always come back to. She stopped anyway.